Welcome back. I hope that you could use your break and change to get a nice burrito, taco, or could grab a coffee or a nice falafel and are now full of energy for our next keynote that we're about to start, Transformation for the City of the Future. And don't forget, you can already log into our Zoom room and ask questions. So go in Event Mobi, and then you find the button Participation. And before we start, Luisa is already with me here in the studio, and you already know her, or at least her wonderful graphic recordings that she makes during the keynotes, or that you probably saw on Instagram and on our Mediathek. And I just have to ask, because we're about to start the keynote, how is actually the process? How do you can listen to the keynote and paint at the same time? How do you do that?
First of all, I try to empty my mind from all the personal stuff that is going on, and then I try to focus with my ears and my whole body on what is said, and try not to get lost in the details, but focusing on the key aspects. And then I write, and then somehow the bigger picture appears, and I can connect the things and find little pictures.
Wow, so you're all ears, all eyes, probably. And you got Instagram or so where you can get inspiration from you or see your graphic recordings?
Yes, it's lou.eszet.
Perfect.
And, yeah.
So you're good to go? You're ready for the keynote? Also with me in the studio and also ready for the keynote is Daniel. Hello, nice to have you in the studio. Daniel, could you give us a brief overview on how this keynote fits so perfectly to future cities?
Well, I think it's two aspects why this keynote fits so perfectly. On the one hand side, I think it's Dirk Messner as a person, because Dirk Messner kind of is for the students, from my perspective, an ideal case and a model how scientists can really engage in real-world problems and contribute to politics, still being a very excellent scientist. And the second one, and I will briefly touch upon this in when I'm introducing Dirk Messner, I think with his work and with his research, with his work in policy consulting, he perfectly combines the different hashtags. You know, it's not only that he is an expert on decarbonization, but he brings together the different aspects in a wonderful way, and therefore I think he's a perfect fit for this keynote. Great. And for this orientation week.
Exciting. I'm really looking forward. So I would say, without any hesitation, let the keynote begin.
Perfect. So, as I said, what is super exciting about the keynote that we will hear in a second is that with Dirk Messner we have a person who really brings the different hashtags wonderfully together. And let me introduce Dirk Messner really using these different hashtags. So on the one hand side we have the hashtag democratic. And Dirk Messner himself is a renowned political scientist who worked in various very influential and important science organizations that work at the science-society interface. And besides that, as a vice chair of the Advisory Council for Global Environmental Change, who advised kind of the German government for many, many years. He also consulted politicians with regards to global environmental change. And I think therefore he's a perfect person to talk about democratic issues and democracy, the role of democracy in cities. The second one is diverse. And with regards to diverse, I already mentioned that Dirk Messner was leading several science organizations at the science-society interface. And there, with this science organization, he had a particular focus on North-South questions and development questions. He led, for instance, for a long time, the German Development Institute. That means he can also talk about diversity. So if we then move forward to digital, I think it's very interesting to go through some of the large reports that the WBGU, the Advisory Council to the German government, wrote over the last couple of years when Dirk Messner served as a vice chair On the one hand side, one was on the world in transition, a social contract for sustainability. Then it was related to humanity on the move, which was related to cities. And the last report, and therefore I think this perfectly fits to the digitalization. The last report of the WBGU was related towards our common digital future, which was focusing on the intersection between digitalization and sustainability. And finally, and I think this is the most obvious, or one of the most obvious, is decarbonized. As the president of the Environmental Protection Agency of Germany, I think he's currently leading one of the most influential institutions when it comes to climate action, climate change in Germany and Europe. And besides that, he was also co-chairing for a long time the Sustainable Development Solution Network in Germany. So, as I said, a perfect candidate for a keynote, a huge expertise, and I look very much forward to the keynote presentation of Dirk Messner. Welcome, Dirk Messner, to our studio, and thanks for joining. Can you hear us? Dirk, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you.
Perfect. So, we look very much forward to your keynote presentation. I heard that we have some slides, and I would suggest that you directly start, and later we engage in a discussion, the two of us, and hopefully also in a discussion with some of the student questions. Thanks for being here in our studio.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So then we can start directly, and I'm looking forward to seeing the slides also.
Do we have the slides?
I think Leonie is managing that.
Yeah, I think the slides are already on the... Okay, they are already online.
Ah, yeah, I cannot see those. So do you see the first slide, the starting slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. So then I move into my field of discussion. I want to talk about cities and their importance for climate protection. And not only for climate protection, but also for quality of life of people. So the SDGs is the overarching framework. And I would like to argue that incremental change is not enough when we think about climate protection, implementing the SDGs, looking at cities. So Leonie, let's move to the second slide.
Mm-hmm.
What you can see here is how I look at the SDGs. You all know the setting of the SDGs, 17 goals. We published a paper last year in Nature, and you see here on the right-hand side the basic slide or the essential slide of this paper, where we tried to cluster the SDGs based on an interconnectivity analysis, where we looked at the interdependencies between the SDGs, where we clustered the SDGs within 6 major, what we call areas of transformation. And if you look at this slide, you see decarbonization, energy on the right-hand side on the bottom. So the energy infrastructure, you can see then food, biosphere, and water. This is mainly the food production system and the interaction of the food production system with the earth system. It is then thirdly, consumption and production. This is the whole industry and production cluster where we look at the supply and the demand side, so consumption and production, from a circularity concept and perspective. And on the left-hand side, you see cities. And this is for us the fourth main transformation field when it comes to implementing it and achieving the SDGs. Number 5 and 6 is then the digital transformation and how the digital transformation interrelates with the transformation towards sustainability and human capacities and investments into humans as the 6th field. So we are going to focus during the next 20 minutes on the city dimension of this overall arena of change towards the sustainability goals. Let's move to the next slide. The main challenge from a climate perspective, so let's focus for a second on the climate perspective, is that we are still, as most of you might know, on a 3.5 global warming pathway. What we agreed upon in Paris 2015 is no global warming beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming. We are still not on track. This is issue number 1, talking about challenges. Issue number 2 is, and this is related to the left part of this slide, the left diagram here, what you can see there is that already around 2 degrees global warming, we move towards certain tipping points in the Earth system. So tipping points in the Earth system is related to large-scale Earth system change, which could damage human civilization large scale also. And the main message here is, if I would have spoken to you 10 years ago or 5 years ago, I would have argued that these kind of tipping points, large-scale transformations of the Earth system, the collapse of the Amazon, for example, the collapse of the monsoon in Asia, for example, this is something which becomes relevant on a trajectory towards 3.5, 4 degrees global warming. What we need to say today, based on our research in the Earth system sciences and the natural sciences, is that already around 2 degrees global warming, we are running into dangerous territory regarding several tipping points. I only wanted to mention at this point in time that, for example, the Greenland ice shield might melt down already irreversibly around the global temperature rise of 2 degrees global warming. And as you might know, Greenland ice shield melting down, this is about 7 meters sea level rise. This is large-scale Earth system change, which we need to avoid. Therefore, staying below 2 degrees, this is something which is very important for our civilization and the future of human beings. Next slide, Leonie, please. To stay between 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming, what we needed to do is we have to halve the emissions globally every decade. This is what you can see here. At the latest 2050 half century, we needed to move down to more or less carbon neutrality and zero carbon emissions. I'm now coming directly to the cities because we need this background to talk about cities in the next sequence of my brief talk. So why are cities important and why do we focus in our work here at the German Environment Agency and in other research institutions and advisory councils on cities? The main point is that we talk about a century of cities. And I wanted to remember you or make you aware of global urban population rising from 3.7 billion 2017, more or less nowadays, towards 6.5 to 7 billion people by 2050. In 2050, 80% of global population will then live in cities. And if you have a historical perspective, what we could argue is that from Uruk, this is one of the first cities which emerged in the process of human civilization more or less 6,000 years ago, towards the first urban people. From Uruk to 3.5 billion humans living in urban areas, we needed 6,000 years. And for the next 3.5 billion people moving in addition to the already existing 3.5 billion people into cities, we are going to need only 35 years. So this is about a huge process of acceleration of urbanization. Therefore, the century of cities, we need to manage the century of cities well if you would like to get sustainability and climate protection right. Let's move to the next slide then. Urgency is what I wanted to focus on now for a moment. If you would ask me to characterize very briefly what urbanization and acceleration of urbanization is about, I would use 3 terms. I would speak, as you can see here in the title, this is about speed and scale and force of the urban dynamics. Force in German would be Wucht, die Wucht der Urbanisierung, the force of urbanization. So speed, scale, and force. Some examples to illustrate this speed, scale, and force dynamics when it comes to urbanization. The first example here is that it's very important to have in mind that 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are related to urban areas. So this is about buildings, this is about mobility systems in cities and energy systems around cities. So if we would like to solve the climate challenge and the climate crisis, cities are obviously key because 70% of emissions are related to cities. The second point, which I'm adding here to illustrate speed, scale, and force is we are going to build the same amount of urban infrastructure during the next 30 to 35 years now towards 2050 mid-century as we have been building since the industrialization. So this is a huge infrastructure. We are talking about an investment during the next decade in this field with a volume of 70 trillion US dollars. This is huge, no? And driving these investments into sustainable investments is therefore so important. The third element which I wanted to add here, and this is very relevant from the climate perspective, as you will see in a second, if we are going to build the next generation of cities for the next 3.5 billion people towards 2050, as we have been building cities during the last, let's say, 200 years, based on steel, cement, and aluminium, and all of that is CO2 intensive and energy intensive, we are going to use up already the climate budget, the greenhouse gas budget, which is related to a 1.5 scenario pathway. This implies that only building cities would bring a 1.5 global warming process. And we are not talking about consumption, industrial production, cars moving in cities, only building the cities. No? So therefore you can see how important the question of how we build the cities, with which kind of materials we build cities, is of high relevance. This sounds very technical, a bit boring, but it is not, because how we build cities and with which kind of material we are going to build cities is absolutely central from a climate perspective. My fourth and last element here is that to talk about speed, scale, and force of urbanization, in China alone, more cement was used from 2008 to 2010 in only 3 years than during the entire 20th century in the United States of America. So one of the most dynamic industrial countries in the world in 3 years. So you see that this is a high dynamic process. And if you would like to get sustainable development right, therefore the focus on cities is absolutely important. And relevant information here is that in most NDCs, so plans which governments present to the United Nations Climate Secretariat for the processes of climate negotiations, cities are still not at the center. We are talking a lot about energy and energy transition, which is obviously of relevance, but we are talking much less about urbanization and cities. And with this kind of data, I would like to make people aware that cities need to be center stage. Let's go to the next slide. If you look at major patterns of urbanization, you will find 3 of those towards 2050. And the main message here is that all 3 are unsustainable. And this implies that we need to reinvent cities and we need to think differently about cities to avoid these kind of major urbanization patterns which we are currently seeing and which might develop further towards 2050. So what are these 3 patterns which we need to avoid? The first pattern is that if we move forward during the next 3 decades, as we did during the last 50, 60 years, we would see 1 to 2 billion new slum dwellers in different parts of the world. Today we have 850 million people living in slums, so we would see then 2 to 3 billion people living in slums. This is about unsustainable development from a human development perspective. The next pattern which we can see is that up to 1.5 billion people will move to rapidly new planned urban settlements. This is about scale, speed, and scratch. You can see here in the middle, Qatar. So this kind of cities from scratch is a phenomenon which we are seeing in many Asian countries. And how to drive these processes of accelerated urbanization with climate protection and linking these processes with sustainable development of humans and for humans is a major challenge. And the third element is that around 1 billion people, this is the new global middle classes, these are the new global middle classes or middle class people, will move into suburbs. You see here Arizona on the right-hand side on the bottom. And this is also unsustainable because suburbs are related to long distances into going into the cities, going to work. We need a densification process when it comes to cities. We need shorter distances. Suburbs is not a sustainable trend. So we need to reinvent major dynamics of urbanization, and we need to avoid these kind of unsustainable basic patterns which we can observe currently. Let's move to the next slide. And with this slide, I wanted to highlight the importance of governance. So I would like to focus on the right-hand side of this slide. if we argue that 70% of emissions are related to local areas and urban areas, and if we argue that 80% of people in 2050 will live in urban centers and urban cities and urban environments, it would be very important to get governance on the ground, right? To delegate political power and decision-making processes to local authorities and local levels, and therefore also local people. Because we do not think that hierarchical governance from the national level to manage urban areas around different regions in the nation is what we would look at. We should look at more power to those levels where dynamic processes of development are taking place, urban areas, local areas. And then look on the right-hand side on the local investments as part of overall public investments in different countries. And the best performer in this regard is Denmark. In Denmark, 62% of investments, public investments, are being done by local authorities. So in a situation of cities gaining importance, this is a good practice, right? And then you can see that in countries like Kenya, Benin, Egypt, only a very small fraction of public investments is being done by local authorities and local actors. And we believe that this is a mismatch. If urbanization is one of the major drivers of human development in the 21st century, we need better, stronger, and capable local governance structures. And this is not taking place in many countries which are governed from a hierarchical perspective from national governments, with little knowledge about what is really going on local grounds in their respective nations. The next slide then, Leonie, is about the size of cities. No? And I could talk a lot about different sizes of cities and advantages and disadvantages. The two main points which I want to make here are the following. First, I wanted to mention that also in 2030, although we talk a lot about mega cities, it is a fact that most people are going to live still also in 10 years from now and in 2050 in small and medium-sized cities with less than 1 million people living in the area, living in the town, living in the city. And we do have a huge literature on megacities. We know much less in the global research community on urban development on small and medium-sized cities. And this is a challenge because we need knowledge, good data, and good empirical grounds when we take decisions. And a shift in our research is needed, therefore. We need to focus more on medium and small-sized cities to get urbanization well done based on scientific knowledge. The second element which I wanted to stress here is that in one of the reports I was a co-author and lead author of, a report of the German Advisory Council on Global Change on Urbanization, we argued in favor of what we called polycentric urban development. And polycentric urban development means that we would like to see these decentralization processes, which I talked about beforehand, so giving political authority to local levels, because this is where the dynamic is coming from in many countries, and then build networks, infrastructural networks, and political networks between the different cities. So thinking not only about hierarchies on the level of nations, and then decentralization on the level of local authorities, polycentric development. This is what we suggest and recommend to get good urban development linked to national development goals. So let's move to the last slide, I think. No, I have 2-3 more, but on the same issue. It is now about urbanization and human well-being. This is what I'm finishing with. I've been talking until now about climate issues, environmental issues, and the dynamic of emissions in cities for the next decades to come, and how we avoid this kind of unsustainable patterns and pathways. Now it's a slide here, which you can see, where we focus, and where I would like to focus on well-being aspects. It is important to know and understand and then remember that if you look at human well-being, you will find a dense relationship between the 1-2 square kilometers around people, individuals, and the way how people perceive their well-being. So well-being is densely related to the development, or to local development, densely related to urban development. And we invented a term to discuss this kind of issue, and we called it the Eigen Art of Cities. Eigen Art is a German word. We did not find a good English translation for it, so we used the German term. Eigen Art means what makes cities specific. No? The German word is nice because Eigen is something which is specific, and Art is a specific system, a city, for example, a mobility system. So we look at the system and we look at cities, at urban areas, but cities are very specific then if you zoom into those. And these specificities are very important for the well-being of people. What you see here are different panoramas of different cities. And what we did as an exercise when we wrote this report, this book about urbanization and sustainable development, we looked at hundreds and thousands of city panoramas. And our question was, how does actually livable and nice cities look like, where we would like to live or where we would like to send our children to study there? No? So what makes cities attractive? And what we found is that this is not only related, as we often think, with the level of GDP, for example. So richer cities are more livable cities than poorer cities. This is not the case. When you look at cities, you will find that there are rich cities which you would not perceive as comfortable, as livable, as attractive. And there are poorer or middle income cities which you might find very attractive. So when we talk about the Eigen Art of cities, the culture of cities, the specificities of cities, we are looking at these kind of characteristics. And we go to the next slide, Leonie. And here you are zooming into cities, no? And these are some aspects which make cities attractive or not attractive. On the right-hand side here on the bottom, you see a very simple diagram. And what you can see here is that if you live, or if people, there is empirical data on that, no? If people live in a city which you would describe as an attractive city, so green spaces, public spaces, good air quality, secure cities, no? If you live in these kind of cities, people use the city, they move into cities, no? If you are living in a city with less attractive characteristics, people go into the city to go to work, to send their children to school, to buy things, no? But they do not use the city as citizens. And this makes a huge difference. So therefore, cities are densely related in the characteristics of cities with well-being of people, but also with democracy, because if people don't move into cities and live together in cities and meet in cities and public spaces, democracy is at stake. No? So cities are related to well-being, cities are related to democracy and citizenship as such. And we move to the last slide now. When I reflect upon cities' well-being and cities and social cohesion in our urban areas, and cities and creativity and innovation, I'm having the following things in mind, no? From the left to the right here. When we think about well-being, this is very often related to how we use in our cities, how we use space. So are there public spaces, or are all most important spaces privatized, no? So not accessible for many people. It is about green places. It is about the aesthetics of spaces or architecture. No? It is about people-centered cities versus automobile and car-centered cities. So how we use the space and how we build space is related to well-being. The second element is then urban form and social cohesion is related. Social cohesion is about identity, social networks, about neighborhood, security. Do you feel secure in an urban environment? Is there trust which is being developed in urban areas? So if you are living in a city which makes it difficult, no, to develop social networks because moving out of your building is something which is not secure, no, or not attractive, this kind of social cohesion will be undermined. So urban form and how we build cities is related to social cohesion. And the last element, of course, cities are the center of creativity, of innovation, of connectivity, of how people are coming together. And cities in this regard are very different. I have been living in Bonn during the last 15 years. Now I'm living in Berlin. No? In Bonn, the United Nations city is very important. The international character of the city is very important. So cities have different characters and should develop different characters. This has to do with identity, this has to do with social cohesion, this has to do with well-being. And therefore, this is very important to remember. How we build cities and how we develop further cities, also in the context of globalization, is a very important space and a very important level of action, urban action, to develop further human well-being and implement the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dirk Messner. That was a wonderful overview of sustainability in cities and transformation that we need. I want to invite our students that you join us via Zoom, but before that, I already have not millions of questions, but quite some questions I'd like to ask. But please, students, come to the Zoom room so that we don't have a discussion only between Dirk Messner and me, but that you can also join our discussion. So that was, as I said, that was a great overview of cities, the relevance of cities, their potential also to foster transformation. But one aspect that was to a certain extent not missing, or you didn't elaborate a lot on this, was really this topic of digitalization in cities. And for me, as I know that the latest report of WBGU, in which you were also quite involved, was on this relation of digitalization and cities. My first question really is, what is the role of digitalization in cities, and do you see smart cities as kind of the solution of our sustainability challenges?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I gave a presentation on smart and sustainable cities 2-3 days ago. So different dimensions here. Now, the first one is that digitalization can help to foster participation, for example. Mm-hmm. So bringing people together, organizing people organizing themselves, people in city organizing themselves, linking their activities to global city networks, for example. So digitalization, social communication networks, virtual worlds and virtual realities can help to foster participation, mm-hmm. and therefore can support democracy. Mm-hmm. We also know the dark sides, which is about privacy, protecting our data. Therefore, a main point which I would emphasize is that I don't believe in technological fixes. Mm-hmm. I see potentials, technological potentials, but at the end of the day, how we bring together these technological opportunities and potentials with social and cultural innovations, mm-hmm. this is what will make the difference. No? Mm-hmm. Beyond participation, maybe only one other element here, driving, how we organize mobility. No? Mm-hmm. Autonomous driving might help to reduce the number of cars in cities significantly. From the German Environmental Agency, my own agency here, we are arguing that we should bring the number of cities in Germany down from currently around 500 per 1,000 people to 150. And digitalization, autonomous driving systems could help to move into this direction.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. A second aspect that I found quite interesting in your talk relates to this aspect of giving more power to local actors, if I understood mm-hmm. correctly, to really give more power also to city. And one big discussion we often have when it comes to sustainability and implementing sustainability is really this question of, is it top down? Do we have to regulate, or is it kind of bottom up that we implement sustainability? And there, my question to you is: do we also have to rethink democracy? You know, if you argue well that we give more power to the cities, what does this mean for our democratic systems, or are democratic systems the best systems to achieve sustainability?
Mm-hmm. So first, the local level and the urban field.
Yeah.
So my personal conclusion after having worked on the city issue for some time now is that I value and emphasize much more the importance and relevance and opportunities and possibilities of governance on the local level. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And therefore we should have not only an institutional setting supporting local levels, we also need excellent people on local levels. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in our own society, if you are aiming for a great career, no, you think about the Bundestag, the national level. You probably do not think about local levels. We should rethink that, because our result here is that many very important solutions and decisions needed to make these solutions work need to be found on local levels in urban areas and cities. And therefore, I would strongly emphasize that. No? And as we saw in many countries, the local level, from the perspective of the architecture of governance, is very, very weak. During the last Habitat conference in Ecuador 2 years ago, where we talked about urbanization in the 21st century, we had a political struggle there, because many people, many elites, do not want to delegate power to local levels, because this would limit their own action fields, right? And therefore, this is a very political issue. So from my perspective, to be successful in terms of sustainability transformations, strengthen local actors and local levels is absolutely key.
And how do you see the current developments in this regard? You know, if we look on a global level, on the global political level, there are at least some tendencies, not in Germany, but if we look to the US, if we look to Brazil, where kind of the state and kind of the leaders of the state kind of increasingly try to capture more and more power. Do you see a trend that this can be realized, or that this is already on the way of being realized, to have more power on the local level?
I see 3 trends here. Well, the first one is there is a strong trend, not at least in Western countries, which is a bit astonishing. No? If you would have talked 10 years before, we might not have expected that. No? We see this trend towards authoritarianism, skepticism regarding democracy, populism, anti-science attitudes. So this kind of trends. No? This is trend number 1. And it is strong. No? In most Western countries, 20% of the population is accessible in this regard, which is frightening, right? Which is undermining the stability of democracies. The second trend is that from a local perspective, in more than 60% of countries, the local level is weak. No? And many of those are countries where urbanization processes are very rapid. This is dangerous, because to manage and shape urbanization, we need stronger local levels. No? So this is trend number 2 and constellation number 2. And element number 3 is that, interestingly, this looks like a contradiction to, or like the other end of the continuum regarding trend number 1, no? Authoritarianism. The third trend is that people have never been more interlinked across countries than today. So transnationalization and transnational networks are gaining huge importance. No? And most people moving into the authoritarian dynamic are not part of the last trend. So it is also a question of elites again. We have transnational elites, and we need to bring this kind of new experiences, cross-country, globalization, shaping global structures and developments. We need to bring this into our societies. No?
Very interesting. And maybe related to this question, we have now, in Europe, we have the Green Deal. Ursula von der Leyen kind of announced this Green Deal. I think it was also courageous, at least from my perspective, that she already started her presidency with saying, well, we want to be the first climate neutral continent in 2050. My first question related to the Green Deal is, and I'm curious to hear your opinion on that, is the Green Deal enough? And maybe the second question is, do you really think that we will be able to establish this Green Deal in Europe with its diversity? But maybe the first question, do you think it's enough, the Green Deal?
I mean, I was surprised positively when Ursula von der Leyen gave their first speech, no? And she put the Green New Deal, the Green European Deal, center stage. And this is simply great. I mean, in the German context, I have been arguing for years now, and several advisory councils, which I have been heading or being a member of to support sustainable development in the German context, no? We have been arguing that in the German context, we do have a sustainability strategy, and then we have a German governance, a governmental strategy, which is about employment, technological development. And we always argued that the sustainability strategies should be at the center. And this needs to be linked with employment, with technological development, with urban areas. No? But this is a parallel strategy. These are parallel universes. No? We have a sustainable strategy, but it is not the center of our political dynamics. Von der Leyen now put the sustainability issue and the sustainability narrative at the center of everything else. No? And then growth and employment and technological development and competitiveness, these are elements and bits and pieces and parts of the sustainability narrative. This is a huge shift in perspective. I'm happy to see that. No? Yeah. Now we need to operationalize it. It's still not operationalized. It is a framework. No? We are all contributing from national levels to operationalize this. For example, we have one of these clusters where it goes around, or where agricultural development is being discussed, farm to fork. No? How a farm to fork strategy would look like, how a better, more sustainable agricultural strategy and sector would look like. This is being discussed now. No? So operationalization is taking place now. And the last element, which I wanted to mention, 4 weeks after the Corona crisis started here in Europe, in April, we brought together the 36 heads and chairs and presidents of environmental agencies across Europe. No? So this goes beyond the European Union. It is about all European countries. And we saw a separation there. So we saw the Netherlands and Germany and Norway and Sweden describing that in these countries, the stronger ones, the economically dynamic ones, the recovery discourse, so recovery after Corona and in the situation of Corona, is being linked to sustainability paradigms and climate protection. And then in countries with already high unemployment rates and high public debts, no, very difficult to stabilize the discourse of sustainability and climate protection in such a crisis situation. So this is about southern parts and eastern parts of Europe. No? And without the 700 billion euro package to invest into the future of Europe, and a larger part of this goes into the weaker economies, we would not have a joint perspective on the next climate goal, for example. So European solidarity is a cornerstone to make sustainability happen in Europe. As a
You know, you have talked also, or you started your talk already with the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think many of us in this field of sustainability really saw this as a major achievement, that the world's leaders, the world community agreed upon that these are the 17 goals that we want to achieve until 2030. Now we have kind of 1/3 has passed of the Agenda 2030. What is your impression? Where are we at the moment after 1/3 of this time between 2015 and 2030? Are you very positive or are you concerned? What is your take on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals?
So many things to say. I would say three sentences. No, the first one is, again, Corona crisis. We did a study here at UBA, at my organization, where we looked at 120 recovery programs across the globe. No? I do not think we missed any important report here. No? So we looked how these reports integrate or don't integrate sustainability goals, climate protection, sustainable infrastructures, or not. No? Because my last experience was in 2008 and 2009 during the financial crisis. Climate protection, sustainable development, environment policies, all of that disappeared from the agenda. It was about growth, and sustainability has been described as a luxury. No? So we looked into these 120 reports, which have been published now in the Corona situation during the last 4 months. And the interesting result is globally, you find very few reports not focusing on climate protection, and sustainability infrastructure.
Yeah.
This is really interesting. So we have a mind shift here. Number two is, if you look then on investments, real investments, not the policy recommendation reports on real investments, Europe is at the center in terms of real investments in this field. The picture is much more heterogeneous and diverse and more negative in many other regions. Observation number 2. No? Observation number 3 is that, and this comes back to one of your questions at the beginning, 2015, when we formulated and decided upon the 2030 agenda, the digital sphere was not part of our discussions. And this is also incredible. I mean, nowadays, artificial intelligence and blockchains and machine learning, we are talking so much about that. But only 5 years ago, this was not part of the sustainability paradigm. And this will be a game changer for good or bad. No? And therefore, looking now at the last 10 years towards 2030, we need to link these two mega transformations towards sustainability on the one hand side and towards digitalization on the other hand side.
This leads me to another question that you talked about, this polycentric development, and you know, as a former director of the German Development Politik Institute, DIE,
German Development Institute.
How do we, you know, I can envision this in Germany, but how does this go beyond Germany? Does this also mean from the ideas that you had in this report that it's connecting, for instance, German cities and cities in Egypt and German cities and cities in Southeast Asia? How can we, you know, bring this global perspective and the local perspective together?
I think this is this polycentric idea and the structure, no? This is something which is universal. I believe that when it comes to globalization, a rise in complexity of our societies, of industries, of technologies, no? And differentiated societies, less homogeneous societies. If we look at all these processes of higher complexity, the two original answers to this have been, or we drive this from hierarchical levels, so nation states or the United Nations, or if you look into companies, no, a strong CEO, a strong head of the company, hierarchical governance was one answer, no? Capable nation states, etc. And the other answer was decentralization, so markets and decentralization, so micro-governance. No? And I think that polycentrism is combining the best of these two worlds, no? The best of hierarchies with the best of bottom-up approaches. Polycentrism is very similar to what we have been discussing about network governance. So I did my PhD 30 years ago. The title of my book in those days had been The Network Society. No? How is wealth being produced? And my answer to that was network societies. No? So beyond hierarchical governance and market dynamics and decentralized structures, how we organize our societies in between and how we combine these structures. This is what makes the difference. And I think this is a universal pattern.
I have only 2 more questions. That means if the students want to jump in, now is the time to jump in. If not, I'm going to ask a student question at the end, or a question for our students. You know, one question that's in cities, but also outside of cities, that I'm often hearing when talking about sustainability is the question of, well, does sustainability not mean that I lose something? You know, that when we talk about sufficiency, that we talk about driving less, flying less, it's kind of this, I have to give away something that I feel important. You now mentioned also several times in your talk that about well-being, that these are places of well-being. How does this connect with each other? You know, this notion of we need to be more sufficient. We can't have the ever more doesn't really work. The ever growing paradigm doesn't work. And on the other hand, you mentioned kind of this idea of well-being. Cities are places of well-being. Isn't this a contradiction, or does this work together?
Yeah, I would have 3 answers to that. The first one is that regarding growth or no growth, you know, this endless debate which we are having, I would say that we needed to define the planetary and local boundaries, you know, of our ecosystems to stop the destruction of preconditions of our civilization, the ecological preconditions. No? If we bring this into our political frameworks, then growth could happen within these planetary boundaries and local boundaries. No? And several sectors obviously needed to disappear. So coal needs to disappear. Anything which is related to fossil fuels needs to disappear. But within these planetary boundaries, innovation and also competition and growth can happen. This is number one. Well, number two is that if you look at the global scale at the well-being of people, no? We have still around 3 to 4 billion people living with less than $3 to $5 a day. So this is about poverty. So for many people, more production is still important. This is different in our kind of societies, where we have a level of incomes already and access to products, which is huge. No? So, but for an important part of the global population, this is still not the case. No? And the last point goes to your last observation. I think that we need to talk much more about good life, well-being, than about GDP per capita or something like that. So how would attractive futures look like for us? No? And concretely, we can discuss this for cities. This has to do with individual income, but this also has to do with how we organize our common goods, no? Our common structures. I talked about public spaces, no? about commons in cities and others. No? So we need a discussion about attractive futures beyond GDP. And for those of you who would be interested to read quickly a report on that, the OECD published a report on that, even defining indicators for what they perceive as well-being of people. And it's a good starting point.
So as I said, as we don't have students, I think, in the Zoom room, I ask a question on behalf of our students, or that I would find interesting now, starting as a freshwoman or freshman. My studies at Leuphana, looking at the next 3 years, if I do the bachelor's only, or the next 5 years, if I do the master studies, what would you say if I, as a student, freshman, freshwoman, want to really now engage into this transformation that you have described? What is the best I can do? What should I learn? What should I do over the next 5 years to really be part of this transformation in cities and beyond what sustainability?
Okay. So first, I would say that we are living in very interesting times, because now, at the end, after 40 years of discussions, we have all the important issue highly on the agenda. No? We are talking about the energy transition. We are talking about the mobility transition. We are talking about the future of cities. We are talking about circular economy. We are bringing all this together in the Green Deal. No? So now it's high on the political agenda. This is why I was so interested in getting this job, which I'm having now, to drive these kind of processes. It's now it's the time, and we have to deliver, no, as a research community around sustainability issues. So what to focus on? I would mention 3 issues. The first one, interdisciplinarity. No? So most of the challenges we are confronted with, and most of the solutions which we need to build, have to be developed by interdisciplinary teams. And this implies that we have to bring together natural sciences, social sciences, and technical sciences to understand better what we need to develop further and to build resilient, sustainable structures. So interdisciplinarity. And this is something which is very often missing. At your university, I know you are pushing this forward. No? The second element is then digitalization. We talked about this. I think for the next 2-3 decades, we will see several huge turns in our societies and economies driven by artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual realities. These are drivers of fundamental change. And how we bring this together with sustainability transformations, no? And how we might develop further the sustainability paradigms themselves in the age of digitalization is something which I think will be of high importance. And the last element is an older debate, but still unsolved. we are living in a globalized world. No? So the interdependencies between our nations, also from a sustainability perspective. No? I mean, most environmental processes are cross-country and cross-border anyway. No? And then we do not only have cities, we have been focusing on cities a lot during the last 50 minutes, but cities are globally interconnected. No? And the economy is globalized, the financial market is globalized. So how we bring globalization, fair global governance, transformative global governance, together with sustainability transformations is something which is really key.
So Dirk Messner, you cannot imagine how well you prepared our students now with your last sentences kind of for their project work, which is particularly about interdisciplinary collaboration for the first year, where they will work in kind of our large module Science Bears Responsibility on the combination of sustainability and digitalization, and for their entire study. So that was a wonderful talk. It's always a pleasure to have a discussion with you. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon again in whichever context, and to welcome you also again at Leuphana. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for this great keynote. And I hand over to Cornelius.
Exactly. Thank you so much for this extensive and informative keynote. That was really interesting. And also thank you, Luisa. This looks also already pretty nice. And we will be back in the evening at 7 p.m. with our pub quiz. Quizzen macht Asta. You can win prizes. This is a pub quiz that you can participate in a digital or analog way as you want. It will take place in German language. And we have super cool prizes for you prepared in cooperation with the Asta tonight at 7 p.m. And you can also just lean back later and listen to Yunus, because Yunus is a musician and he does a mix of jazz, rap, and he has a viola. So it's a big combination, but it's amazing sound. Looking forward to that. And now you continue in your project group sessions and start engaging with vision. So you can think about how to tackle problems of your future and your vision of your future. With that said, I would say enjoy. Thanks for watching and see you on campus.